Charles Barkley started from a place almost nobody would have predicted. He was a 5'10" backup point guard who couldn't generate serious recruiting interest coming out of high school. In the 1984 NBA draft, he was selected 39 spots after Michael Jordan. Barkley has spoken about that journey himself, on camera, in his own words. Now, Kenny Smith stepped into a TNT podcast studio and made a point that got people talking. According to Kenny, Chuck did not arrive as a polished superstar. He argued that Barkley truly developed after reaching the professional level. Then, he laid out 3 simple questions that challenged the way a lot of fans remember Barkley's rise to greatness. 3 questions, 3 answers, and none of them paint the picture most people expect when they think about a future Hall of Famer climbing his way to the top.
And this wasn't coming from just anyone. Kenny Smith is a 2-time NBA champion, the 6th overall pick in the draft, a first-team All-American at North Carolina, a McDonald's All-American, and one of the top high school players in the country during his era. The man has spent decades immersed in basketball, from locker rooms to TV studios to NBA courts all across the country. When Kenny speaks on greatness, people pay attention. And the player at the center of this conversation was none other than Sir Charles himself, one of the most recognizable figures the league has ever produced. Barkley went on to win the 1993 NBA MVP award and led the Phoenix Suns to the NBA Finals. He earned the nickname the Round Mound of Rebound and built a career that landed him in the Hall of Fame. But Kenny's argument was that the story most people tell about Barkley's path is missing a critical piece. According to that discussion, Barkley was never seen as a can't-miss prodigy from day one. He was a young player out of Alabama who had to grind his way into the spotlight. Reports from that era frequently pointed to concerns about his weight, and his physical development became a defining part of his overall story. Kenny said it plainly on camera, and the conversation that followed only made that point hit harder. The conversation wasn't about natural height or early fame. It was about growth, improvement, and a player who made a career out of proving people wrong. Then came what many considered the sharpest moment of Kenny's entire argument. He didn't just throw out a flashy opinion to generate buzz. He pointed directly at Barkley's pre-NBA resume and laid it out with 3 questions and 3 numbers. No McDonald's All-American selection, no first-team All-American honor, no College Player of the Year award. Kenny's point was straightforward. Most elite prospects arrive in the NBA with at least one of those major accolades already attached to their name. Barkley arrived with none of them. And then Kenny dropped one more detail that even the show's host appeared caught off guard by, pushing the conversation into an even more unexpected direction. 0 NCAA tournament wins. Not a Sweet 16 appearance, not an Elite 8 run, not a single tournament victory across Charles Barkley's entire college career. During Barkley's time at Auburn, the team played just one NCAA tournament game, a first-round matchup against Richmond in 1984. The game went down to the final seconds, but Auburn came up short, falling 72-71. The podcast host was visibly stunned by that stat. He leaned back and said, "I didn't know that." It was exactly the kind of fact that stops people cold when discussing one of the most celebrated players in basketball history. Kenny Smith has a way of surfacing details that most fans either overlooked or never came across in the first place. His point wasn't that Barkley failed, it was that Barkley's path looked nothing like the typical superstar blueprint. There were no massive college tournament moments that turned him into a household name overnight. Much of his growth happened quietly, away from the brightest spotlights, long before he ever became an NBA icon. And then, Kenny added another layer to the discussion. Kenny fully acknowledged Barkley as one of the greatest to ever play the game, but his argument was that the version of Chuck people remember was built after he reached the NBA. In Kenny's view, the legendary reputation came from what Barkley became as a professional, not from overwhelming dominance before he ever got there. What made the conversation even more compelling was that Barkley himself has openly talked about those early struggles. On his own podcast, he looked back and reflected on just how far he had to come as a young player. Rather than deflecting the criticism, Barkley has consistently spoken with honesty about the obstacles he faced and the work it took to get better. And the deeper you dig into his story, the more surprising it gets. His recruiting process drew very little national attention. He wasn't one of the most heavily recruited prospects in the country. By the time serious evaluations began, most major recruiting decisions had already been finalized, and only a handful of programs were genuinely considering him. The options that surfaced were largely close to home in Alabama. Barkley weighed his choices and ultimately landed at Auburn, a practical decision at the time that offered him the best shot at meaningful playing time and continued development. That choice turned out to be one of the most important of his career. While other highly ranked prospects arrived in college carrying national hype and long lists of accolades, Barkley showed up with far less fanfare. His entire journey was built on proving doubters wrong rather than living up to expectations that were already set for him. Then came another challenge that seemed to follow him everywhere: his weight. Even while putting up strong performances and leading the SEC in rebounding for 3 straight seasons, the conversation about his size never went away. People noticed his production, but a lot of attention also went toward his appearance and conditioning. Media coverage from that period frequently highlighted the contrast. Barkley was delivering on the court, yet many observers still viewed him as an unconventional figure in the sport. Rather than fitting the mold of a polished basketball phenom, he was consistently described as a unique talent who found ways to succeed that nobody quite saw coming. He entered a locker room filled with respected veterans and established stars.
Among them was Moses Malone, a center who immediately saw that Barkley had enormous potential, provided he committed to improving his conditioning and overall approach to the game.
That moment would become one of the most significant turning points of Barkley's entire career, setting the stage for the player basketball fans would eventually come to know and celebrate. Just picture it for a second. Charles Barkley, the future MVP and Hall of Famer, sitting there emotionally after hearing hard truths delivered by a basketball legend. It's a side of his story that looks nothing like the bold, confident personality fans see on television today. At that point, he was still a young player trying to find his footing in the league, with a lot left to prove. And the number that changed everything? 50 pounds. That was the difference between the player Barkley was when he entered the NBA and the player he eventually became. He arrived around draft time weighing nearly 300 pounds, but over time he transformed himself both physically and mentally. By the time opponents genuinely feared matching up against him, he had completely reshaped his body and redirected his career. That transformation didn't happen overnight. According to Barkley himself, one of the biggest turning points came from the guidance he received after reaching the NBA. The lessons, the discipline, and the accountability he was exposed to as a young professional completely altered his trajectory. In his own words, "It changed my whole life." That one statement says everything about what that period meant to his development.